Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and when we last left Jackson, he was formulating a plan to link up with Edward Johnson to move further west and attack an advanced Union force. Stonewall Jackson called on Ewell and his division to occupy Swift Run Gap, while he crossed over the Blue Ridge Mountains at Brown's Gap to Meacham Station, and loaded his men on trains to Stanton. He hoped that this would convince Banks he was leaving the valley, but that didn't work. Nevertheless, Edward Johnson's troops had been pushed out of the Allegheny Plateau near Stanton by the approaching brigades of Brigadier Generals Robert Milroy and Robert Schenck. If Fremont's army and the Mountain Department ever linked up with Banks, then Jackson knew he would not have an adequate force to confront them, so he must defeat them in detail. On May 7th, Jackson and Johnson pushed west toward the little hamlet of McDowell. On the morning of May 8th, Milroy and Schenck collaborated on a plan to halt the approaching rebels. The 2nd Virginia Infantry sat atop Sitlington's Hill, with the 1st Virginia Cavalry positioned along the turnpike, and part of the 73rd Ohio sat to the right of the 2nd Virginia. The 82nd Ohio, with an artillery battery, covered the road to the west. At noon, rebel forces could be seen approaching. It was Jackson and Johnson and their staffs arriving to reconnoiter the ground. Jackson did not want to fight on that day and made preparations to outflank them in the morning. To deal with the skirmishers on Sitlington's Hill, Johnson deployed the 52nd Virginia, but the fighting grew more intense, and the 44th Virginia was called up to strengthen the Confederate line, with the 58th close behind to secure the right flank. The rebels were able to force the Federal soldiers back. A lull covered the battlefield, except for the fire of the Union artillery. Jackson assumed that was the last of the fighting for the day, but he was horribly wrong. Milroy and Schenck agreed on a reconnaissance in force against the hill. He assembled 5 regiments to attack Jackson and Johnson's force. Likewise, seeing the assembling Federals, Johnson moved up additional reinforcements. It was after 6 p.m. before Milroy's Ohioans and Virginians made contact with Johnson's lines. Members of the 31st Virginia and the 3rd Virginia collided near the turnpike. Both units had been part of the same militia unit before the war at Clarksburg, Virginia. When the Civil War broke out, the unit split in its loyalty, and now they faced one another on the battlefield. They got close enough to one another to recognize individual faces and called out to their former friends. Jackson sent in reinforcements to relieve some of the embattled units. The 12th Georgia, out in front of the main line, was running low on ammunition and fell back to the main line. The 48th Virginia took its place and stabilized the line in the face of the approaching Federals. About 9 p.m., the firing slowed down. Although Milroy's troops made gallant attacks up the hill, they could not push the numerically superior forces away. At around 10 p.m., Milroy ordered the evacuation of McDowell. When the battle closed, the Union lost 26 killed, 230 wounded, and 3 men missing, for a total of 259 casualties. The Confederacy lost 146 men killed, 382 wounded, and 4 men captured, for a total of 532. The 12th Georgia represented a large portion of the casualties because of their advanced position during the battle. After McDowell, Jackson gave chase to the retreating Federals. Schenck and Milroy lit the forest on fire on both sides of the road to further hinder the approach of the Confederate columns. They withdrew to Franklin, where they believed Fremont would meet them, but when they got there, he was nowhere to be found. Jackson and Johnson advanced on Franklin. They had successfully prevented the linking up of Banks and Fremont, and driven the forces in front of Johnson away. Now Jackson sought to link up with Ewell and deliver a blow to Banks, especially now that Shields' division had been sent east out of the valley. Ewell was given conflicting reports from Lee and Johnston. One of those directives stated that if Banks left the valley, Ewell and Jackson were to go east to link up with the Confederate forces at Fredericksburg. Half of Banks' force had left, but the other half had remained, entrenched around Strasburg. So Ewell traveled to speak with Jackson at his current location outside of Harrisonburg. They agreed to link up to attack Banks, the best option to divert troops away from McDowell's force near Fredericksburg. To make the march through Page Valley quicker for Ewell, he would detach Richard Taylor's Louisiana Brigade from his main force to pass to the south of the Massanutten Mountains, and then join Jackson's columns as they moved toward New Market and Mount Jackson. They hoped to link up on May 21st. However, as Ewell made it to his objective, a message came from Johnston were calling Ewell's division to Richmond to confront McClellan. Jackson and Ewell met in a grove of trees and decided that the best way to protect Richmond was to attack Banks and draw troops from McDowell. A message then came from Johnston stating, "If you and General Ewell, united, can beat Banks, do it." The two Virginians agreed that attacking Banks's fortifications at Strasburg would be foolhardy, so they would move into Page Valley and attack the Union garrison at Front Royal, placing themselves in between Banks and McDowell, forcing Banks to retreat from his fortifications. All of Jackson and Ewell's forces met at New Market. From there, Taylor's brigade led the way through New Market Gap, while leaving a few companies of cavalry just south of Strasburg to screen the army's movements, as well as give alarm if Banks decided to move in either direction. The Gray troops passed through the Massanutten Mountains and approached the little town of Front Royal, Virginia on May 23rd. Jackson's troops surprised the Union garrison guarding the town. The small band of occupiers saw Confederate soldiers approaching at 2:30 p.m. Jackson sent Ashby's cavalry on the west side of the river to tear up the railroad and cut telegraph wires, as well as probe the flanks of the garrison troops. Next, Jackson called up the 1st Maryland to start the attack. What the general did not know was that many of the troops' enlistments had ended. Those troops mutinied and were placed under arrest until the campaign was over. But when called upon, the commander of the 1st Maryland delivered a rousing speech that brought many of the mutineers back into the ranks for the fight. They approached the town with Wheat's Tigers on their left. By surprising the Federals, the Marylanders and Louisianians forced the Unionist Marylanders north of town, where the terrain was more defensible atop Richardson's Hill. The famous female spy Belle Boyd was in the town when Jackson's men began to move through it. She ran to Confederate lines and informed part of Jackson's staff that the Federal force was small and could easily be whipped, then ran back into town. The information that she relayed was not new to Jackson, who knew that only a small force garrisoned the town. The two sides skirmished back and forth, but more rebel regiments were showing themselves on the field. It was now around 4 p.m., and the noose was tightening around Kinley's Marylanders. The 2nd and 6th Virginia Cavalry regiments galloped down the Strasburg Front Royal Road and put pressure on the 29th Pennsylvania, who guarded the flank across the river from Kinley. Ashby's troops threatened the troops near Buckton, making an attack on their encampment. However, the blue troops were too well equipped and prepared for the cavalry, driving Ashby away from their camp. Kinley called for the 5th New York Cavalry to lend him some help. They crossed the river to the other side, taking enemy artillery fire and musketry as they did. Kinley threw them into the fight, which threw back the rebels for a few moments so his Marylanders could catch their breath. The 5th joined the men from Maryland to defend Richardson's Hill, but Richard Taylor's brigade was fast approaching. The 6th Louisiana fell into battle line on the Tigers' left, and the 8th Louisiana extended the Confederate right to the railroad. Kinley now knew his command would be completely encircled if he did not get his men across the bridge at once. The 1st Maryland began to cross the bridge first, with the 5th New York performing a delaying action. Kinley wanted his infantry across both bridges so they could form a defensive line on Guard Hill. Once across the first bridge, they then crossed the North Fork. The only thing saving Kinley's infantry was that the 1st Maryland Confederate and Wheat's Tigers stopped in the Union camps to pillage and loot what they could find. Kinley then set up defenses on Guard Hill, and as the last Federal troops made it over the bridge, the structure was set ablaze. The two sides threw iron and lead at one another from across the river. To prevent the Confederates from pursuing, Kinley had to stay on Guard Hill until the bridge became so engulfed in flames that the enemy would not dare cross or put it out. But as he examined the bridge, he saw the 8th Louisiana crossing a ford to the east, and cavalry crossing a ford to the west. He was under the threat of being encircled. This time, the withdrawal was more disorderly, with infantry, cavalry, and artillery fleeing as best they could. Lieutenant Colonel Parnham, commander of the 29th Pennsylvania, after nearly getting his head caved in by a sword, was captured by Confederate cavalry. He and a bunch of his men were placed under guard. As they sat on the ground, Parnham thought of a plan. When his captors turned their backs, he jumped up and declared, "Here comes our reinforcements." The guards took off, and Parnham and his men made good their escape. Not all of them made it safely, though. 2 members of the Keystone State were discovered hiding in a field. A Confederate asked them who they belonged to. After stating the 29th Pennsylvania, the rebel stated, "It's a good thing you do not belong to the 28th Pennsylvania. I am going to kill every one I come across of them fellers. They stole all my old woman's pigs." Kinley did not escape. He went down with a saber slash to the back of his head, a slight cut on his neck, and a grazing wound to the head from a pistol ball discharged at point-blank range, together with numerous bruises on his face and chest from falling from his horse, made him a horrible sight. However, he survived. He was kept captive in Front Royal for a while, and his excellent treatment of the citizens while he occupied the town resulted in its citizens bringing him many fine meals while in confinement. He would be exchanged in June. The Union lost 773 men, 691 were captured, the others being killed or wounded. The Confederacy lost just 36 men killed and wounded. Although it was a small victory, it had great implications. Jackson had fooled Banks into thinking he was still south near Harrisonburg, but now he interposed himself between Banks and McDowell in the east. Reports of the defeat would trickle into Banks's headquarters. He now had a big decision to make.